This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Hi everyone and welcome back to today's episode of Coronial. My name is Emma.
I'm Georgie.
And I'm Alice.
So today we will be discussing the coroner's inquest into the death of Jason Walter Chalice, who passed away on the 10th of May 2017, aged 25. I've also just realised that today is also the 10th of May.
Oh, wow.
Good work on bringing the correct dates case.
You're very welcome. For those listening, it is currently the 10th of May 2025. So it is the anniversary of Mr. Chalice's death. At the time of his death, Jason was a member of the Australian Defence Force. He had joined the Army Cadets at age 12 and had left high school in year 10 to become a qualified joiner. After working for a joinery company for 8 years, he joined the Defence Force in July 2016 and undertook basic training near Singleton in New South Wales. On the 24th of February 2017, Jason was posted to Darwin in the Northern Territory as a rifleman attached to Bravo Company, 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. He had obtained the entry-level rank of private. The 5th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment is a battle-ready battalion, and the Bravo Company is the rifle company. As such, the company often completes training exercises ready for rapid deployment. I should also say from the outset, there is quite a lot of Defence Force terminology.
Okay.
I'm getting that.
This.
Yeah.
I've tried my best to use it correctly and to explain what it means where I understand what it means, but I really do apologise if I use any of the terminology incorrectly. It's not intentional.
I really appreciate you explaining because, I'm already like, oh, what? Oh, okay. Oh, that. Thank you.
Yeah. I've tried my best. So yes, they complete training exercises ready for rapid deployment. One such exercise was Exercise Tiger's Run, which was a large training exercise to be held between the 5th and 17th of May 2017. It was a battle group level exercise where the whole of the battalion was involved. It took place at the Mount Bundy military training area near Darwin.
And how large was the military battalion? Do you know?
Didn't actually say, but I think there's appears to be sort of battalion, and then within those battalions there's platoons, and then again there's sections.
Okay.
So maybe a couple of hundred people?
So large battalion,
Largest
smaller
battalion, platoon.
platoons. Okay.
This is what my understanding is. I'm sorry if it's incorrect. And then smaller again as sections.
Okay.
And then they've also got the company as well, which I think the company has several different sections.
But either way, this is a large exercise.
It's a large exercise with a number of soldiers involved. So after Exercise Tiger's Run, the battalion was immediately going into Exercise Southern Jackaroo.
How did I come up with these names?
Yeah, I know, right? It's going to be Exercise A and Exercise B.
Well, no, because I do
boring,
way
though.
too many of them in a year.
Yeah.
Like you'd up to
ZZ.
exercise. Yeah.
That's not as fun. So Exercise Southern Jackaroo was running from the 8th to the 29th of May 2017, and this was a joint training exercise with international forces.
Oh.
So Exercise Tiger's Run was just an Australian Defence Force exercise, and then, they were looking to go into Exercise Southern Jackaroo, which was an international. Yeah.
Okay.
So Exercise Tiger's Run was a live fire exercise designed to provide experience in a number of areas, including urban operations.
I mean, what could go wrong with a live fire run?
We'll see.
Does it mean live firing as in you're firing live rounds?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it might be like you're still firing a gun, but they're blanks.
No, they're dry runs.
Yep, okay.
We've already seen how firing blanks can go wrong.
Yes.
They're not firing ammunition in dry runs.
Okay, so there's no
blanks.
firing.
There's
Okay.
no firing.
There's no blanks. Cool. Well, then, sure, call it a dry run all you want.
I have a premonition.
So for these exercises, special ranges are conducted at the military base. In this case, an urban setting was constructed.
Mm-hmm.
However, there were some delays with setting up the range for Exercise Tiger's Run due to the roads being impassable due to weather conditions. For this reason, the range was not constructed prior to the exercise as usual, but rather was constructed over the first 2 days of the scheduled exercise. On the 8th and 9th of May, the company undertook the urban attack section. The range had been set up to resemble a village. There were 3 mock buildings on the left-hand side of the road and 3 on the right. The mock buildings were made of plywood and hessian.
Okay.
The exercise was to find a person of interest. That was to be achieved by the section being divided into 2 bricks of 4 soldiers. So brick is like a group.
Okay.
It's a collective of soldiers, much like
correct.
a murder of crows. Okay. A brick of soldiers.
Yes.
Sure.
And I do refer to bricks a lot. And so 1 brick is 4 soldiers.
Cool.
1 brick was to work their way through the buildings on the right of the road, through those 3 buildings on the right-hand side, and the other through the buildings on the left. So there were 2
Makes sense.
bricks deployed for each exercise. Inside the building, there were drop head dummies. So these were the targets. The drop head dummies were sometimes concealed, so they weren't obvious targets
Okay.
Okay.
from the outside.
Right. Okay. They could be hiding in a cupboard or behind something.
Theoretically,
or-
yeah. On the left-hand side of the road, the dummies were positioned on the walls away from the road, so you couldn't see. As I said, they were concealed. You couldn't see them from the road. They were on their own side. Behind those walls was a danger zone because rounds fired at these targets, being the drop head dummies, would be expected to travel through the dummies and through the plywood walls. So,
Oh, yeah.
And if
them.
you missed the dummy.
Well, even if it hit the dummy,
it's
it could
gonna
go
straight
through.
So yeah, basically the area behind the exercise is a danger zone.
Yeah.
Yep.
Each brick consisted of 4 people, as I said, a section commander, a point, a cover, and a machine gunner.
How many of
Okay.
them are armed? Only the machine gunner, or like they're all
No, I
4
think
armed?
they're all
all
armed.
would be.
They're all armed.
Because
Okay.
they're the rifle company, so they would
Correct.
all be armed.
True.
Yes. 2 engineers were also included to detonate explosives. They were not armed. Well, I mean, they're armed with the explosives.
They're armed with a detonator?
And I think that's a simulation
Okay.
kind of situation there as well. Accompanying each brick were 3 safety supervisors, 1 for the engineers and 2 for the brick.
Okay.
On the road behind each section was an armoured vehicle with a machine gunner. Private Chalice was the machine gunner in the brick clearing the buildings on the left of the road in his particular section.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
his role was to provide support to the point and cover who were entering the building. So I'm assuming, again, this is a bit of an assumption, the point is the main rifle person, and then the cover is the one who are covering them in case there's an attack.
Yeah.
And then the machine gunner is then also providing that support,
Cover
similar
and
to what the cover's doing. And then
Okay.
there's the section commander, which is obviously the one who is commanding the
Yep.
brick. So when it came to his section's turn to do the live fire run, Private Chalice's section alighted from the vehicles to move to the respective sides of the road that their brick was assigned to. Private Chalice's brick walked to the bush on the left-hand side of the road because, as I said, they were clearing the left side. On the direction of one of the safety supervisors, they engaged with an enemy target on approach to the first building. They then made their way to the back of the building. At that point, it appears as though the soldiers did not know where the entrance to the building was. The entrance to this particular building was facing the road, so it was at the front.
Yeah.
Right, so they've gone to the wrong side of it.
So they've gone to the wrong side. And Private Chalice took up a position at the back of the building.
Is he in the
Excellent.
danger zone right now?
He's in the danger zone.
Okay.
At which point, just even a sign on the back of the building being like danger
This
zone.
is all stuff we get into.
Yes,
into.
but if you're in a real life situation, there won't be a sign saying this is the danger zone.
Also things
True.
we get into.
But in a practice,
You just want your practice to be as lifelike as possible so that you're ready to deal with these situations in real life.
fair. Pros and cons.
And this is a lot of the part of the commentary that we
Yep.
will discuss because it's all very valid. So yes, as I said, Private Chalice took up a position at the back of the building. It's not known why he took that position. He may have been told to, although no one ever admitted to actually telling him to do that. Or he just may have considered that that was the best vantage point to cover the entry to the building.
Right, especially if he thinks the entrance is at the back.
Correct. They don't know where the entry is. He might think that's
But at this
the-
point, he's lost sight of his team members if they've gone around.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The point and cover walked down the far side of the building towards the entrance, which again was at the front, and they became dislocated from the rest of the brick and the safety supervisors. So the point and cover have gone off. They've gone to the proper entrance where they're meant to go, but
So now the
sight.
safety supervisor also doesn't have eyes on all four of them to know
What's
that all
happening.
four of them are safe.
Correct.
Okay.
The point and cover kicked open the door and then realised the rest of the brick was not with them. Realising that it would be unsafe to fire, the point and cover raised their weapons and applied the safety on their weapons.
Okay,
Good.
I like the point and cover. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good choice.
So the section commander walked down the side of the building and noticed that the point and cover were near the doorway. He did not say anything to them, but walked to the rear of the building and said, "Be careful, that dude is around the front." So I'm assuming he said that to Private Chalice, but it's really not clear.
That dude.
That dude is around the front.
You're in the army. Don't you have words that you use instead of that dude? Like,
But what do you mean that dude? Like, as in, he said that to Chalice. Like, there's one.
about the
There's
point
two,
and the cover. But
there's
yeah, there's two
people,
of them.
But like,
I'm assuming that he said that to Chalice because it wouldn't make sense the other way around because
Unless
he's at
he
the
was
back.
thinking...
he's at the back, correct?
But unless the commander was thinking that the back of the building was actually the front of the building.
Which could have been the case as
So
well.
he was talking to the point and the cover saying, hey, look out, there's someone at the front. Which was actually the back.
Which is also potentially true. And that would actually make more sense,
Yeah.
to be honest.
But it's still
not clear.
confusing.
yeah,
But he's basically said to someone that, hey, someone's not where they're meant to be.
Yeah.
At that point, the safety supervisors assumed that the brick would stack for entry into the building. However, that did not happen.
Yeah, which makes sense that the point and the cover have clearly seen that no one else is with them, so they've stopped.
Yeah, they've stopped.
The
and
thought would be that everyone else would catch up to them and then they would go in as one.
Correct. And that's what a stack is. A stack is
reconvening, whole brick together,
everyone
let's
going
go.
in together.
Yeah.
So the practice supervisors observed that there were soldiers at the front and the rear of the building. They weren't stacked, ready to go in. So they yelled, "Stop, stop, stop," as an emergency stop to the exercise.
Yep.
Those in the building immediately turned around and walked onto the road. However, Private Chalice remained at the back of the building.
Is
So
he just
for
not
whatever
here,
reason,
or-
we don't know.
Because I mean, was there live fire coming from the other side? You know, from the right hand side or anything like that?
Oh,
like,
yeah, like,
surely
was
it
it super
potentially was a
noisy?
loud environment.
I'm not sure. It didn't go into
Yeah, why?
sort of the
But yeah.
environments or like why he didn't return.
Yeah.
But just the fact that he didn't.
Yeah.
So the stoppage allowed the opportunity for the brick to reset. However, they did not reset at the place that they had been setting up previously. So they're obviously in a slightly different environment to where they had been setting up. The reset took 53 seconds and no one noticed that Private Chalice was not with them and that he was still covering his position at the back of the building.
Why is the safety supervisor not doing a simple head count?
Why is
It's super
anyone not
easy
doing
to
a head
do.
count?
Why is the commander not doing a head count?
There's not that many of them.
Yeah, it's not like you've got 50 people.
I think there's 8, including the other brick. But it's still not a lot of people.
Are the other side stopping?
It's not clear. I would assume it would be for both sides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't clear.
Yeah.
And they're sort of talking about like this brick went and restacked at this
Yeah.
spot. So I'm assuming that the other brick has gone and reset at another spot. Yeah, no one counted or checked the stack at reset.
That is literally your entire job as the safety supervisor.
It's actually not.
But also, you said it only happened for 53 seconds. What's the rush? Why does it need to be 53 seconds versus like 5 minutes?
Because they're training.
They're training and there are a number of sections
yeah, that have to
that are
get
going through. So they do need to get
Yeah,
through
okay.
a number of training exercises as well. So after the restart, the point entered into the building and fired a shot at the drop head dummy on the north wall. His rifle jammed and he stepped back. His cover then fired a number of shots at the dummy. Private Chalice was behind the plywood in line with the dummy.
Oh, no.
That's just like unbelievable chance, right?
Yeah, because remember, Private Chalice doesn't know where the dummy is.
No.
Yeah.
It's concealed.
And he could have been any point along that wall. And of course, he happened to be right where the dummy was placed.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And I think everyone can understand what has happened.
Yes. He was shot.
Yes, he was shot in the head. So the point and cover then moved to the next room in the building and they cleared that next room. Shortly after the section commander noticed that Private Chalice was missing, he sent the others to look for him, and he was found on the ground wounded behind the building. He was immediately treated at the scene and evacuated by helicopter to the Royal Darwin Hospital. However, his wounds were incompatible with life and he was pronounced deceased.
That's really hard for the other people in his, brick, but also company.
Yeah.
That they're on a training exercise and this happens.
The point and cover shot their own teammate.
Correct,
Like, that's just horrendous.
And knowing that you
obviously
did it inadvertently.
Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't mean to do it, but it's still happened.
Well, you didn't know he was there.
Yeah.
Oh, that's hard.
That's horrible.
It's terrible. So the death of Private Chalice instigated a number of inquiries by different authorities, which were considered by or referred to in this coroner's report. The first such inquiry which was completed was undertaken by the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force. At the time of the report, Comcare was also undertaking an inquiry in relation to any breaches of the Work Health and Safety Act. That inquiry was incomplete at the time of the publishing of this coroner's report in January 2019. However, I did have a look up for some news articles, and news articles indicate that the Department of Defence was charged with exposing a worker to death or injury in which it pleaded guilty in early 2021. It was fined $1 million, and at the time, and it still may be, I haven't looked this up, that $1 million fine was the largest fine ever recorded under Commonwealth work health and safety laws.
As it should be.
But also that is a lot of, that is a big fine.
That's a big fine. I think the maximum fine is 1.5 million. In this case, it was downgraded to 1 million because they pled guilty. There's always that element of cooperation you're going to get.
Yeah. And not to say it's not warranted, but it is still a lot of...
It's a lot of money.
And where does that money go?
Consolidated Commonwealth revenue.
Yeah, right. So it's not a victim of crime payment. It's not going to his family.
No, it's
his family
not.
will have got a payout, but
Yes, but
yeah, they did. They got some sort of compensation that was the amount was suppressed by the courts.
Yeah, fair.
Right. I'm sure other people die in the workplace though, so maybe I'm just feeling like this is more extreme because it's gun violence and it's active attempt versus other people that might die in the process of their work due to an accident.
Negligence.
This is still an accident, but again, I think it's because it's using something that's actively meant to kill someone versus a machinery that the purpose is not to kill.
Yeah,
maybe I'm feeling more negative about it because of that, and therefore thinking the consequence should be higher.
This is an extremely high-risk activity, obviously, because you're using live gunfire.
But so is chopping down a tree with a chainsaw, so I guess
it is, but I feel like this is even more so.
Yeah.
It is an exercise with live gunfire.
And not just live gunfire, one person on a range in a more controlled setting. It's you've got multiple people involved. They're all moving freely. Yeah.
Yes. So, the inherent risk of this kind of activity, I think, it's really up there. Yes, I agree. Chopping down the limb of a tree is still inherently dangerous.
And still could equally result in a death of an individual as a result of it being in their workplace with an accident.
It's just more so, I feel like, in this circumstance, the strategies to mitigate any injury or accident, there should be really stringent processes in place because of the
exactly that
potential scenarios that people could be put in, which are very reasonably foreseeable when you've got live ammunition flying around a place. I think the intention of live ammunition is to affect the death of someone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another one of the reports at the commencement of the inquest, the coroner was provided with a recent report said to be into the systemic issues relevant to the death of Private Chalice. This was referred to as the Woodruff Inquiry, which had recently been completed, and this was completed by the Australian Defence Force. I feel like just the way that it was reported in this coroner's inquest, that it was very much an under wraps kind of inquest and inquiry. It's, again, the Defence Force.
And because even when you're talking about this, the Bricks were doing this exercise where, the two houses were like this and this is how they did it. Mm-hmm. That was probably relatively confidential information prior to the release of this inquest. I would say
even the names of the exercises and things like that would have all been completely confidential.
Yeah, and so like I can see why the army needs to keep it relatively confidential or certain aspects of it, but to then kind of hush it away doesn't necessarily improve the public trust in the Defence Force.
That's correct. So the coronial investigation itself was described as being extensive. It was undertaken by a detective of the NT Police Major Crime Unit, so not actually by the Defence Force, although, as I said, they
did their own inquest. Yep.
It involved the reconstruction of the building and 3D printed computer-generated model of the building. Assistance was also obtained from the New South Wales Police to provide computer-generated crime scene reconstruction. So they really...
True, because I imagine the Northern Territory's crime division would be nothing in comparison to New South Wales, where there's a higher population density.
Exactly, and, you know, the technology that they have accessible to them is probably a lot more limited.
Yeah.
But it also shows, like, how seriously
they took this.
They were taking this. Like, this was a full-blown to the top investigation in terms of the investigative skills that they deployed.
Absolutely. Should be.
As it should be. From the outset, the coroner noted that there was obviously human error involved in this death, but cautioned away from the natural tendency to look at the persons involved on the day and try to work out a particular person to apportion the blame to. Rather, the focus of this inquest was on whether there were any appropriate systems to ensure that human errors by individuals don't result in the catastrophic compromise of safety. Absolutely. And if they were in place, why they failed in this circumstance.
Yeah.
So he put it out there right at the start of this inquest saying there was human error.
But
Private Chalice shouldn't have been in the position he was in.
Yeah.
But what systems were in place to stop him from being there?
Yep.
And if so,
because
why did they fail?
Who designed it in terms of as an activity? And should they have not known, like, the danger zone sections and been involved and been like, the moment they see someone in that danger zone, be like, nah, calling it.
And I guess that's the difference between the people who set up the circumstance and the people who were then running it in terms of those commanders. Because in my mind, they should have had a briefing on here's how it's all set up. This is where all the dummies are. And like, it's hard because obviously in real life, the commander is not going to know the exact position of everyone who's in that building. But from a safety point of view,
this is not real life.
Yeah, it would be good for the commander to know, hey, everyone stop. They don't have to tell the people that this is where the dummies are, but they can direct people away from the danger zone.
That's right.
If they know where it is.
And this is obviously a large part of what the inquest discusses, but it is that tension between, you know, training and getting that experience in and doing it safely versus trying to emulate a live situation, what these people are actually going to go into. But the reality is you need to get that training under your belt first before you start contemplating any of these sort of testing sort of scenarios where you actually think about, okay, this could be a live situation.
Yeah.
Let's not know about where the dummies are and things like that. Like, so Private Chalice had joined this particular Bravo company in the February and it's now May.
Yeah.
So this is probably his first training exercise with live fire.
I think it's his second. Yeah, I think it's his first with live fire.
Yeah.
But it's only his second training exercise ever.
Yeah.
So
it's not unexpected that he's
separated
from his command because he's not been through that kind of exercise before.
That's right. So that shows, yes, human error has happened. He shouldn't have been where he was, basically, is what they're saying. But there should have been mechanisms in place.
Yeah, what protections were there for him?
Exactly.
That if he got out of place, how to keep himself safe.
Correctly. And they know how junior he was.
Yeah.
There should have been better protections for him in this situation.
But they also, they didn't realise he was missing.
Yeah.
And I feel like at the core of it, that is the main problem. Because if they realised he wasn't with them, they wouldn't have started again until he was with them.
Yeah. The Bricker 4, like I find it weird that they didn't
realise that someone was missing.
Yeah. They were headcount amongst themselves.
I know.
All right. Points here, covers here.
Where's our machine gunner?
Yeah.
Yep.
So as I said, it appears that Private Chalice was in the wrong area during the exercise. That's not up for debate. However, it is unlikely that he knew that he was in a danger zone and standing behind a concealed target.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's no way you would be there voluntarily if you knew it was a danger zone.
Exactly. He was entitled to have sufficient information or direction to know where he should and should not have been standing.
Yes.
And without this information, he could not exercise the individual responsibility to take care of his own safety and the safety of those he was tasked to support.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I still stand by the argument of like, how could you not have just written danger zone on the danger zone side?
It seems like a simple solution, doesn't it?
Mm.
And I get that it's meant to be realistic, blah, blah, blah. But there's a difference between realism and like when you don't actually need to risk someone's life.
That's right. This is not the scenario. These people, as I said, are very fresh, and I'm just about to talk about that. They're not at all ready for deployment.
Yeah.
You need to get them to a standard where they're going to be deployment ready. And yes, maybe shortly before deployment, they can have these exercises, although we'll get to something that happened similar to that. But that's more a situation where they can go in sort of more blind into the scenario.
And I think, like having those scenarios where there are some of those keys of like, okay, this says danger zone, then gives you more of an education process where you'd be like, you see how you ended up in that danger zone. Yeah. Like when you come back later and you go, see that sign? Like that.
And that's where I got lost. That's where I got separated. Yeah. Like that's how I got into that area. I became disoriented, whatever it is. But you can kind of learn a little bit more from it rather than this alternative.
Did you say that this company was meant to be battle ready?
Yeah, but I think they're training.
Okay. Because I was just thinking like maybe that's why they wanted to make it as realistic as possible, because they wanted them to be able to be deployed immediately.
I think it's meant to be like a battle ready company, but you obviously need to go through the training and stuff for it to actually be battle ready. But I think there's potentially a difference between being a battle ready regiment that's actually going to be deployed, as there might be other companies that
hopefully slightly more senior people in front of you who are more deploy ready.
Yeah. But there also might be other companies that are never going to be deployed. They're companies for a different purpose.
Yeah.
As well. So again, my knowledge of the Defence Force vernacular and how that works is not my strong suit.
Neither.
But that's my understanding. So as I said, at the time of this exercise, Private Chalice had only had 10 months in total training, or 10 months in the Defence Force.
Mm-hmm.
And this was his first live fire urban operation exercise. He had never been on that range before or seen that building before.
Mm-hmm.
The coroner said that there should have been systems designed to ensure that Private Chalice had sufficient training and awareness to ensure his own safety. It also appears that the majority of the section at the training that day were new recruits as well. So the section commander had more than 10 years experience and the second in command had just over 2 years experience. But the rest of the section only had slightly more experience than Private Chalice did. They joined the army between February and July 2016. So, 12 months.
Yeah, okay. And then if he'd been with the Defence Force for 10 months, what was his actual shooting experience as well prior to that? Do we know if is that something you come on board and end up in that section? And don't worry, I'm aware you're shaking your head. Do you come on board and get put in that division because you have shooting experience, or do you come on board and then literally get taught how to shoot a gun? I'm
not sure how people get sort of posted to the different companies.
And this is in a country of Australia where guns are not a particularly big thing.
Yeah.
Presumably you have to have some skill, and presumably that gets determined at some point along the way.
Yeah.
I think they would do the firearms training and basic training.
Yeah. So that's you getting
deployed to a company.
Yeah, so he did.
But had he been in the company for 10 months or had he been in the...
No, he'd been in the Defence Force. For 10 months. He did his basic training in Singleton.
Yeah.
And then he was then deployed to Darwin from February 2017, and this occurred in May. So he's only been actually in a company for 2 months.
But also if he was trained how to use a gun in basic training, again, that's still within the preceding 10 months.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
That he learned to shoot
use
a gun.
one and to start with.
He didn't shoot the gun. But his team members as well, if they were that junior, could have also been that new and inexperienced.
Correct. So the extent of his experience, as I said, had the basic training.
Yeah.
But since joining the Bravo company in February of 2017, he and his fellow section members had been to an exercise in Townsville from the 19th to the 23rd of March, and then to a training exercise at Kangaroo Flats from the 3rd to the 5th of April. At the Kangaroo Flats exercise, there was a combat shooting range, but the Townsville exercise, there was no live fire. So, and my understanding is a combat shooting range was not like this kind of
village
kind of situation. It was more like a shooting range.
A point and shoot.
But there's no one sort of, running around the shooting area.
You're aiming at a target.
Correct.
And every human is behind the line sort of thing.
There's no one in the line of fire. So this was the first situation that he'd been in where there was live fire where you could potentially be injured.
Yep.
I struggle with this kind of stuff.
It's hard because you've also got to start somewhere. When there's live fire, there's live fire.
And it happening when you're deployed, I get it.
Yeah.
It's not the first time that you should be doing it, but
But see, that's why I just think that you need better leadership and oversight of everything that's happening. So that obviously if it's your first time, you may put yourself in a dangerous position, which is why you have
training.
That's why you have the safety supervisor there to help ensure your safety.
But also, what's the negative of just having used blanks or paintballs?
Well, yes, true.
Like, why does it have to be real ammunition?
I mean, at some point it does have to be real ammunition because they need to be used to shooting that.
Yes, but you could do
that, but that doesn't need to be
the first
within 2 months of you joining the company.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could even do like within the same operation, the first one you do is with blanks.
Mm-hmm.
The second time you do it is with live ammunition.
Yeah. And there is, again, talk about that a little bit later on and we will go through that. But their concern was that it's not realistic because you've already been over it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it's been 2 months in the right time to sort of be introducing that, or should it be more progressive?
Yeah. That's difficult.
So the particular safety mitigation for urban operation in live fire training exercises was at the time of Private Chalice's death found in Chapter 15, Annex K of the Australian Defence Force Range Orders 2015. The orders are collectively referred to in the Army as doctrine. So when we refer to doctrine, it's like the set of Army rules.
Sure. Are these things we're meant to have read like all the way through to Annex K, or is this just like a general like?
Probably.
I think, generally everything right through, but obviously in relation to this live fire urban operations, Annex K is what is relevant. But yes, they should. So the relevant parts of the doctrine in relation to Annex K include that A, training must be progressive, dry practices must be conducted prior to proceeding to blank firing, after which personnel may proceed to ball ammunition. So that's suggesting
a progression of dry run and then blanks and then ammunition.
Yeah, correct. That the practice coordinator is to ensure that all practices develop progressively and that the level of training does not exceed with the individual or collective ability of the participants.
Yeah, I'm not getting that sense in this particular instance.
Yeah, because even if everyone else in his brick
had
done this
had
before,
the dry run and then the blanks, he had.
Yeah, he had.
That's not the collective ability there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Progression in training. All training must be conducted as a progression where the practice coordinator witnesses the training progression in order to ensure that the firers and safety supervisors have reached the appropriate standard prior to live firing practice. It is essential that training progression be included in any approval to conduct urban operations on a Category C range. I assume this is a Category C range. I don't know what that means. Both dry fire and blank fire practices must be conducted prior to each progression. The dry practice reinforces a safety brief and any mandated walkthroughs.
Yeah, and I agree like with you saying before that if you walk through it, then it defeats the whole purpose of the run.
Yes, for the brick.
Yeah.
But I think the safety supervisors.
Yeah. And the commander.
Yeah, right. Yes, all of them should have
absolutely should know what they're doing and know how to direct.
How did they not? So they're meant to just go in blind as well. Like, what is the point of safety supervisors?
Well, yes, if they don't know anything about where the safety or where the hazards are.
What was their role?
Well, their general role is to remind them where the hazards are. I think in this circumstance, they may have had a walkthrough because they were able to direct them to that target at the start where they were like, go that way.
The building entrance is here. Yeah, okay.
So At this point, I'm just going to introduce another report that had been made several years prior to this inquest, and it concerned walkthroughs, the marking of walls, and counting stacks, which is all something we've already touched on. But other safety mechanisms, and this particular report is called the Coltana report.
And is it a Defence Force report or
Correct.
an inquest report?
It's a Defence Force.
Defence Force, okay, yep.
So other safety mechanisms were recommended in the Coltana report after the death of Lance Corporal Mason Edwards in October 2009 at the military training area in Coltana, South Australia. So this is sort of akin to the Woodruff report that was into the death of Private Chalice.
Yep.
They've obviously done a separate report into the death of Lance Corporal Mason Edwards. So on that occasion, there had been a group of soldiers going through an urban operations exercise, so all very similar. However, these soldiers had significantly more training than the soldiers in Exercise Tigers Run. So these were a lot more experienced.
Yep.
They were actually being assessed for readiness for deployment overseas. So they were sort of in their final stages of getting ready to be shipped out. So this was a night live fire exercise.
Oh, God.
Oh, so much riskier.
And one of the teams took cover behind a plywood building in line with an internal target. Lance Corporal Mason Edwards was fatally shot and another soldier was shot in the arm.
Wow. Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah, because I guess that in that case, it wasn't just someone by themselves separated from the group. They were all there.
Correct.
Oof.
So the Coltana inquiry was held by the commander of the Defence Force, and changes to the doctrine were recommended, including that there be a walkthrough of the range by the soldiers prior to the exercise, and that the danger zones be marked on the exterior walls of the buildings.
Oh, excellent. Okay. I think the walkthrough then, again, still defeats the purpose of the exercise. But I don't see why the danger zone can't be marked.
Mm-hmm. It was also recommended that the team leader should also count and check stacks.
Absolutely.
Yes, obviously.
So in the report into the death of Private Chalice, the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force noted that it's apparent that the recommendations contained in the Coltana report concerning the death of Mason Edwards on 20 October 2009 in a night live firing exercise that took place in similar circumstances were not utilised in this particular exercise.
Mm-hmm.
These, in essence, included that no-go areas behind concealed targets be marked on the outside of walls containing such targets, that the team leaders observe, count and check stacks to ensure full awareness of the position and preparedness to move of each team member, and that in live fire exercises, participants be made aware of each area of operations, including by having a walkthrough of such areas prior to the commencement of any exercise. The inquiry considered that it was reasonable to suppose that if any one of these measures had been utilised in this exercise, being the exercise that led to Lance Corporal Mason's death, the likelihood of the incident occurring would have been significantly reduced.
Agreed.
Yep.
So basically all these recommendations have been...
existed already.
Yeah, correct.
And they were even, in some respects, they were in the doctrine. Oh, I suppose not necessarily to that depth.
They were in the doctrine.
Yeah.
Maybe not as
explicit.
Yeah.
But the suggestion that you needed to be more experienced and that kind of thing was there.
But basically these recommendations in the Coltana report were saying that they need to be more explicit in the doctrine. They're already there, but they should be made more explicit.
But then that wasn't changed and
no one took any notice of it anyway.
Yeah.
And so you said it was delayed in terms of setup. Was it meant to have danger zone marks?
They never would have.
They were never going to put them out anyway.
No.
Okay.
And I understand that it was never really practiced prior to that point to put them there.
Right.
Even though it was recommended in this report 8 years afterwards.
And maybe it was one of those things where because it was 8 years later, it was too far in the past that like the people who were actively involved in this operation maybe weren't even in the army 8 years ago or were fairly junior and so they didn't ever hear about the report.
Yeah, but I dare say like it should have happened at any point after that report came out.
Definitely.
And so therefore it should have consistently continued to occur.
Yep.
And so, you know, I assume there was at least one other active exercise between 2009 and 2017.
Yes.
You would have thought there were plenty.
Yeah, I would have hoped so.
So at this point in the coroner's report, the coroner noted that the Coroner's Act provides that where the coroner considers it is necessary to compel a person to answer questions and where those answers may incriminate the person, the coroner may provide a certificate that prevents the answers being used in other proceedings.
So now we get to the juicy part.
Yes, because 5 witnesses that were called during the inquest sought certificates with the possibility of disciplinary proceedings being a primary concern. Because remember, Defence Force, they have their own disciplinary tribunals.
Yep. Yeah, so then does the Coroner's Act actually prevent...
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so it extends to those potential ADF disciplinary
Cool.
tribunals. So the coroner found it appropriate to provide certificates to all 5 witnesses to ensure that there was no concern about answering questions in contemplation of some other proceeding or proceedings. So basically, he found it appropriate to say, I would prefer you to be truthful.
Yeah.
And that is
or just I'd prefer you to answer, because I guess they have the option to not answer.
Correct. Yep. The coroner did note that all of the soldiers who provided evidence were impressive individuals and gave their evidence in a clear and truthful manner.
Oh, that's nice.
So they did their duty.
Yeah.
So the coroner noted that on a reading of the relevant doctrine by a person unaffected by the traditions and culture of the army.
Okay.
It indicates that prior to a live fire exercise, there should be a dry run rehearsal and a blank fire rehearsal on the range where live fire exercise is going to take place. Further, where the exercise is complex, a walkthrough should precede the rehearsals. It's basically, and I think as we all pointed out on that reading of the doctrine, there should be a walkthrough, there should be these dry runs and these blank rehearsals prior to live fire.
None of which were done in this case.
Mm-hmm. That interpretation is not consistent with a strongly held tenet that live fire exercises are designed to emulate actual combat conditions. They are designed to be dynamic to invoke stress and the flow of adrenaline.
That's fair, but I also like safety.
I agree.
Like, I don't think there's any way you can truly emulate that.
No, until you're actually in that situation. But I also understand them wanting to emulate it as much as possible for the preparedness factor.
Yeah.
Do you need to emulate it? 100%.
But also, maybe you do emulate it, but on the 5th time that this particular group of people have done a training exercise.
I don't know. I'm still for like, it should just be blanks. I still struggle with like...
Is it necessary to risk these people's lives at this stage?
I don't think ever, until you deploy them.
But these people are in the army, they're getting deployed into situations where it's a high possibility that they will lose their lives.
Yeah, but like if you use blanks, you can then still try and work on all of those education points without having had someone die beforehand.
But does it evoke that adrenaline and that dynamic situation that they're wanting to invoke?
I don't think anything can except the real thing. I get that they're trying to get as close as possible.
But can it when you know that there's live fire around you? I think it's going to raise your adrenaline levels.
But we still know that things like blanks aren't nothing. They still can kill someone. Yes. We've seen that happen.
Yeah.
Like they still propel an explosive. They still cause simulation of a gunshot. So I don't see how that's not a better option. That's not a safer option while still shooting a weapon and aiming at a target. Like,
is that a better option though? Because you're also saying that these can cause death.
Well, yeah, but they're not meant to.
They are less likely to cause death.
They're less likely, but...
Yeah, the instance that we saw where it did cause death, it was like a chest shot at short distance, right?
Yes. It's not going to happen when you're shooting through plywood and a dummy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's like, tell me why that isn't a viable option. And I know your argument is it isn't because it's not realistic. But why would we risk a life unnecessarily? Also, like, what is the percentage of our army population that gets deployed to live fire?
I guess
areas?
It depends on the
context of the world.
Correct. Yeah. The temporal element of when you're talking about the deployment, right?
Yeah.
Like, I understand all of that. I also don't have the knowledge about what it is like, if there's any difference between firing blanks and firing live ammunition in terms of the feel and those sorts of things.
And whether you can visually see whether you've hit your target if you're firing a blank.
Yeah.
That makes a good point, because they are also firing at concealed targets. Will a blank actually reach the concealed target?
Yep.
And for me, it's that, well, is there an alternate option from, like, say, a paintball perspective, that it's like you're doing one scenario to work on aim and you're doing one scenario to work on making it the most realistic you can, but that neither scenario needs to involve live ammunition. And, like, I guess we're learning that the answer is no. But I'm still not seeing a really 100% justification to me as to why the answer is no.
But I sort of feel like even if you are using live ammunition, like, this death was not just because they were using live ammunition. It's because the safety protocols they should have had in place weren't in place. So they could have been using live ammunition in this exercise and no one died because the safety processes they had in place worked.
Yes.
If you are doing live firing, you need to have really strict safety protocols in place.
But no one would, again, we think in theory, no one would ever die if you just use blanks, though. So that then even if those safety protocols were not met, the inherent risk to people would still be...
It would be lower.
Significantly lower. I personally stand on one side because, you know, I just don't see the need for live ammunition, but... like, it's still me trying to just put that premise out there of, like, no, but really tell me why you absolutely had to use live ammunition all the time whenever you do these things. And I still not sure I'm convinced that you have to.
And again, without, you know...
I'm not in the army.
I've never fired a gun. I don't know what that feeling, that experience, it's not something I've been ever exposed to. So I don't know. Someone who has had that experience might come up and say, no, there is a real difference between the two. And if that's the case, then yes.
Then it can't be replicated.
It can't be replicated. And we want to send, remember, these people are preparing for situations where they are defending their country.
Yeah.
They want to be as prepared as possible. And that is what it sounds like they have to engage in live fire exercises in order to be as prepared as possible. Because at the end of the day, what they're doing is, like, of utmost importance in terms of, you know, the protection of
the country. But I want to keep them protected as much as possible beforehand.
I agree.
Yeah.
In the evidence, one of the soldiers noted that there's a default mindset that runs counter to the risk mitigation measures outlined in the doctrine, which we said require dry walkthroughs followed by blank rehearsals. In this particular soldier's view, there's still ambiguity as to the scope of the doctrine in terms of whether to use actual live fire range or similar for rehearsal. So they're basically saying what you said. Like,
yeah, what's the necessity?
Exactly. Or there's just ambiguity around it, and what's actually in the doctrine
is counterintuitive in that sense. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So from the evidence given in the inquest by various platoon sergeants, it appears that this ambiguity resulted in inconsistent practices in different areas.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So
I would have thought that would have been fairly consistent across like the ADF. Okay.
You would, but as, you know, sort of pointed out, the doctrine definitely says that these things should happen prior to live round run-throughs, but it seems to be Army sort of tenet not to do it and to make it as real as possible. So because of that, there's just, you know, differences between how different platoon sergeants like to run their particular exercises.
That's fair. Each has their own preference.
Yeah, but I feel like
that definitely shouldn't be happening.
Stakes. Yeah. It should be all
There should be some level of audit that's happening to make sure all of the sergeants are using the same processes.
Yeah. Doesn't it make you a little bit concerned that sections that are defending our country can't?
They're all interpreting the same
thing in
piece
different
of information
ways, and they're not uniform in their application.
And no one's picking up on the fact that they're interpreting them differently.
Example of like legislation exactly that though, that you could put the same piece of legislation in front of 10 different individuals and they'd interpret it differently, even though it's using like defined words and in a defined context. So like it's so hard to write an instruction that will be interpreted the same by every single person.
Yeah, it's very true.
Which is why you then do an audit to make sure everyone is of the same understanding.
Or you just like actually communicate with people.
Yeah.
And educate them the same way.
Mm-hmm. So some platoon sergeants saw dry runs as optional and did not do them, whereas some required soldiers to undertake dry runs. So in any event, The sections of the 5th platoon, which was Private Chalice's platoon, did not undertake a walkthrough or dry run rehearsals. There was also evidence that this was the most complex range that they had ever encountered.
Yeah. It was his only range that he'd ever encountered.
Exactly. According to the Woodruff Inquiry report, at the time of Private Chalice's death, the recommendation for all participants to have a walkthrough of the range had not been adopted, nor had the recommendation to mark danger zones. The recommendation to check and count stacks was also not doctrine at the time.
That's like a fundamental.
Yeah. However, since the death of Private Chalice, including before the coronial inquest, it had become doctrine for all participants to have a walkthrough of the range unless there's a specific exemption not to do so by the formation commander. He didn't go into what that specific exemption would look like. There was also still some ambiguity as to whether the marking of danger zones was doctrine at this point. So they haven't sorted themselves out.
Please.
In relation to that.
Just do it.
I just come back to the fact that a head count is so easy to do.
So simple.
It's really not that hard.
Army camaraderie? Isn't that like
you are looking out for each other?
Principle of
the army is that you are in a team that is all working together. That you should all be looking out for each other. So like, isn't it all of their roles?
Yes.
Shouldn't every single one of them be checking that all of them are there?
Yes.
I agree. I think it's hard to disagree with that. So what actually happened on the range regarding safety and walkthroughs on the morning of 10th of May when this happened?
There was none.
So in accordance with doctrine, the safety supervisors did do a walkthrough of the finished range along with a safety briefing. So safety supervisors had a walkthrough and a briefing.
But what did that involve? Did they go into the danger zone?
I'm assuming they would have had a full safety briefing about where the danger zones were so that they could advise the soldiers where the danger zones were.
Okay.
However, the participants were not.
And that seems fair in the context of the exercise that they were doing, so long as they had someone else looking out for them. But also, I would have assumed the places that were dangerous would have been signed.
Would have been pointed out or signed in some way. And I also would have thought that it may be beneficial, again, for people who have not done this before.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe, as Alice said, if it was their 5th time doing it.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe a different story. A dry fire rehearsal was offered to the platoons. 2 platoons took up that offer, but the 5th platoon did not.
It should not have been an offer.
It should have been mandatory. The dry fire runs were not scheduled events, so they had to take place around other activities, and this is where maybe that late assembly of the range could have impacted potentially. So when Private Chalice commenced the Urban Operations Live Fire Training exercise, it was the first time he had been on an urban operations range.
Yeah.
3 sections undertook the exercise before his section did. They were the sections that all had dry fire runs the evening before. They didn't have the mission profile, so they didn't actually know what the mission was, but they'd gone through and actually seen the range.
They knew where the entrances to the buildings were.
Entrances to the building, and presumably where the danger zones were.
Yeah.
I want to know how many people went to the wrong side of the building. When they went and did their dry run, how many people went to the wrong side?
Don't know.
If that's 100% of people, maybe go, this exercise is not great for live fire.
Yeah, or maybe if we do live fire, everyone should have a dry run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the practice coordinator was impressed with the 3 sections who had the dry runs preparation for the exercise, and they sort of said that it seemed like that they were well rehearsed in what to do. So
because they understood where they were going.
They knew where the entrances were. I would assume they may have made mistakes during those dry runs.
And that's okay because they didn't have guns.
Yeah, correct.
Even if they were carrying them, they had no bullets in them.
Yeah. Correct. It doesn't emulate exactly then what a real life situation would be like when you'd go into, a war and you wouldn't know what the layout and everything is.
Yeah.
But they didn't know what the mission profile was.
Yeah.
So they didn't know exactly what they were doing.
Yeah.
They just knew what the layout of the range was
Yep.
for safety purposes. So Private Chalice's section was the first section to undertake the exercise who hadn't had a dry run, and the practice coordinator noted their lack of preparation showed immediately.
So cancel, pause, stop.
Well, they did call a stop.
They did.
They just didn't count all the people.
For more than 53 seconds.
So the lack of preparation showed by A, the engineers without ammunition were initially leading the brick.
That's not how that...
No, they're not meant to be leading the brick.
Okay, wait, hang on. In general, in any practice that I assume that they would have ever done, wouldn't the engineer always know to be at the back?
They would, but I think from what I'm getting from this, that this brick was so unsure of what they were doing that the engineers were like, come on.
And this is why you do a dry run.
Exactly.
Or maybe this just hinted that this team was not ready to have done this exercise.
They're not ready for it. B, the brick failed to observe a target until they were almost upon it. It had to be pointed out by a safety supervisor.
Yep.
C, they stopped behind the structure in a danger zone. D, there was no separation between the engineers and the brick, so I'm assuming there should be separation.
I guess that maybe that's why, not that the head count was done, but why the individual members of the brick were like, everyone's here, because the engineers were with them and
when
normally
they shouldn't
they're
have
not.
been. Yeah, that's
so like maybe. Their initial thought was like, yeah, it seems like there's enough people around for us all to be here. But it's because the engineers are normally
further away.
Yeah. Maybe.
Well, normally, they'd not normally done this before.
Yeah, exactly. They don't know what normal is. E, the two leading members of the brick dislocated from the rest and continued to the south side, causing the practice coordinator to call an emergency stop and then restart of the exercise and reset of the stack prior to entering the building. F, upon restart, there was a failure to note that Private Chalice was not stacked with the rest of the brick. And G, after the restart, the firers went under a window through which they were expected to have targeted a drop head dummy.
Right.
So they've just gone to the complete wrong place after the reset.
Oh my God.
Shambles.
And at which point, like, A through G, that they could have stopped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have let them reset and start again.
Yeah, the point where they went, something's not right.
Yeah.
It should have been a walk away.
Yeah, correct.
And that would have been their dry run.
Yeah, you're not ready for this.
Let's go again.
Let's go again without ammunition.
From the beginning.
Yeah, and let's work this out. So since the death of Private Chalice, doctrine has been changed. So the urban operations is now Chapter 6, Annex J. On the first page, there is a warning between red lines. It says, warning, it is mandatory for all personnel participating in live fire ball urban operations range to conduct a walkthrough prior to the conduct of the practice. This mandatory requirement can only be exempted by the formation commander when they are satisfied the team conducting the activity have progressed through appropriate Army training levels within the fourth generation cycle.
So maybe they're people who are literally just about to be deployed.
Yeah.
They've already done heaps of training. They've done heaps of these exercises where they've had dry runs. And then maybe even they've had live fire exercises where nothing has gone wrong. Like there's been no near misses.
Yeah.
They've all followed it exactly to the letter. They're clearly showing they can work together as a team.
I was about to say, and there's also that camaraderie established within the team where they know how to work together.
Yep.
These people are just four people that have
never worked together
before. There's got to be teething issues.
Yeah.
The end of the warning says failure to comply with this directive may result in casualties occurring. The warning also states safe entry, the engagement of targets, and the placement of all participants is to be reinforced during participant walkthroughs and rehearsals with adjustments, if required, made by the practice coordinator in consultation with the safety supervisors to ensure that the practice remains safe. When in stack prior to moving, the team leader is to report to safety staff following an oral, visual, or physical check of their team. Safety staff are then to verify the team leader's report and inform the practice commander that all members are correctly positioned, accounted for, and ready to proceed prior to entering the building. So, moving back to the Woodruff inquiry, there were a lot of areas covered by this inquiry. The method of the inquiry was to interview key Army personnel and conduct focus groups. During one of the focus groups, one of the members indicated that when he asked whether a walkthrough had happened, he was told that it had not, because if they did, it would not be a test. And when they go to war, they will not do a walkthrough.
Like, yes, but this isn't a test, it's training.
And that is exactly, but it was also noted that these soldiers were still in training and were not being tested for deployment.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're in training. There was then discussion about training versus testing and where that boundary lies between when these walkthroughs should be ceased, basically, and when it should just be a live fire exercise.
Well, yeah, because I mean, the walkthrough literally could have been like from the exterior, just to say, these are the 3 buildings you're going to be going to.
Here's the entrance.
Don't stand at the back of the building because you'll be at risk.
Yeah.
You didn't have to go in and see where each single dummy is. You just need to be told that this is where you'll be at risk.
And I mean, it doesn't work for, potentially like night exercises and things where there might be visual restrictions, but marking out danger zones.
Yeah.
Visually marking them out.
Yeah.
Seems like a really simple solution.
Yeah.
Like, yes, it won't work in all circumstances, but
in
this circumstance, it would have.
Yeah.
So something odd that came out of the Woodruff report that the coroner pointed out was that it seemed to use the logic that if people could be demonstrated to have failed in their function, i.e. there was human error, that there was no need for system reform or strengthening. What? For example, it said that the Army implementation of the Coltano inquiry recommendations or lack thereof implementation had been sufficient because the lack of situational awareness of those involved was not due to the insufficiency of the doctrine.
Yes, it was. The doctrine didn't say anything about doing a head count.
I'm sorry.
And marking the danger zones.
This is not entirely just victim blaming, being like,
yes,
he shouldn't have stood in the danger zone.
That is exactly what it's saying. They're like, there's no point of us changing the doctrine because it wasn't the doctrine's fault. It was the person's fault for standing in the danger zone.
Oh my God.
Okay, yeah, they definitely deserve their $1 million fine.
Yes.
The conclusion of the report included the line, and I quote, "The inescapable fact is that it does not matter what policies, guidelines, doctrines and safety measures are put in place, the human factor is always present." To which the coroner's response was, and I again quote, "There is no doubt about that. That is the very reason multiple systems are so important to ensure that when human factors intervene, tragedy is not the inevitable outcome. But in this case, it was not simply human factors that intervened. There was catastrophic system failure."
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't just say we won't have any procedures ever because humans are human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then why do we have an army?
But also, I don't think his human error was necessarily his fault.
It wasn't.
No.
As the start, we already explained, like, he was entitled to know what was and was not safe, so he could then deploy his own judgment about where he should be standing. He wasn't even afforded that.
Yeah.
It's not like he was told this is the danger zone and he's like, I'm gonna go stand there.
He wasn't told you're standing right in front of a target.
Yeah.
He had no idea. He was just thinking that he was covering the building where he was meant to.
Yeah.
He was not exercising any judgment.
He didn't have enough information.
Because he wasn't afforded the knowledge to exercise that judgment.
I can imagine the coroner reading that report and just being like,
excuse me? What? And actually,
that report would have been sent to like his family as well, right?
I would assume so.
Oh my God, can you imagine being the family that's just like reading this being like, sorry, did they just say that my loved one made some human error and therefore it's their fault?
It's his fault.
What?
And
God,
funny,
that's
the
insulting.
coroner in this report, he actually explained in writing the concept of the Swiss cheese model after this.
Oh, my favourite model.
Yeah, which I was like, oh, Georgie. He explained it, and I was like, I've never seen that explained in a coroner's report before, because he was like, what you're saying is incorrect.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there were 18 recommendations to come out of the Woodruff report. The majority recommended further review or reinforcement, but there was also a recommendation against further doctrinal change.
What? That's not a recommendation. That's a nothing. Why put that in there?
Yeah. Basically
your recommendation is to do nothing.
He was standing in the wrong place. That's not doctrine's fault, so we're not changing it.
Oh.
But the previous report had already said, change these things.
Yeah. Made the recommendation to, and then it was never done.
Yeah.
I'm so mad right now.
Let's get into the coroner's comments. Because he had some.
I'm sure the coroner was very mad too.
And this is all from the perspective of the coroner that I'm saying this. It is difficult to get past the fact that in a live fire training exercise at the very first building, there was a dislocation in the movement of the brick that ultimately led to 3 members being on one side of the building and the 4th member on the other side. Private Chalice was inexperienced and had not had the benefit of being trained on a complex urban operations range before. He was not provided the progression of training on the range anticipated by doctrine, i.e. rehearsals. If he had been given a walkthrough or a dry run, it is unimaginable that he would have been in the back of the building in line with the concealed target. His death was clearly preventable, as was conceded by the army at the outset of the inquest. The failure to follow doctrine was not the failure of one or two or even a small group of individuals. It was not a mistake, forgetfulness, or momentary inattention. It was a failure by the whole chain of command. It was a systemic failure in the true sense of the phrase. The reasons for that failure seem not to have either been appreciated or there was an unwillingness to confront them. The coroner then pulled out a quote by the acting commanding officer of the Bravo Company who said, "It is a hard job to maintain training level. I still believe you can't continuously have to start from the beginning again and work your way up, or we'll never be able to meet the directions of the Australian government to protect this country if you continually do that." So basically he's saying it's annoying that we have to restart from the beginning.
But also no one's asking you to restart from the beginning in all cases. Like
it's a progression of training.
It literally says progression.
Like, is it acceptable to not restart and risk someone's life?
No.
That's unacceptable.
It's the whole thing of like learning, right? If you don't understand something, go back to the basics.
Yeah.
But maybe it's acceptable to the army.
It shouldn't be.
It should especially not be acceptable to the army. So the coroner noted that the perceived change from dynamic to staged may have been the reason for the failure or refusal of the army to accept the recommendations on the Coltana report that there be a mandatory walkthrough. Or it might have been thought unnecessary if there were mandated dry fire and blank rehearsals and optional walkthroughs when training complexity increased. It is obviously a difficult balance for the army, but I encourage them to resolve these competing requirements between safe training and dynamic training in an explicit manner.
I think that's even a little bit soft to just encourage it. I'm like, no.
It's recommended.
Yeah.
I suppose all they can do is recommend.
Yeah.
True.
In the coroner's view, the evidence established that the exercise that led to the death of Private Chalice was a shambles, which was, funnily enough, the word Alice used.
Me and the coroner are on the same wavelength.
While there may have been issues with currency, competency, and experience, the major issue was that Private Chalice was not given the benefit of a dry run. To see that as a lack of currency ignores the systemic issue that failure or refusal to appreciate that doctrine mandated a progression of training that included rehearsals. The coroner then noted that it is now practiced to conduct rehearsals prior to live fire exercises.
I'm glad that they've done that.
Are they actually implementing it though?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Well, at least at the time of this report. This is in 2019. Who knows?
Surely they're kind of taking a back step.
Yeah.
Surely.
I would hope not.
I would hope not. There's still the issue of danger zone marking, and there appeared to be conflicting evidence on whether this was mandatory at the time of the report. If it's not mandatory, the coroner encouraged the army to rectify that, stating it is one more system to prevent our young men and women from being needlessly killed.
Yes.
Agreed.
We are unanimous in that.
Yes. On to the recommendations. The coroner recommended that the army resolve the confusion as to the interpretation of Chapter 6, Annex J, by making it explicit what rehearsals are mandatorily required to be undertaken by participants on a range prior to it being used for a live fire exercise. The coroner also recommended that if the army determines that a rehearsal or rehearsals are required, that the mandatory requirement of those be highlighted in the annex, as has now been done with the requirement for walkthroughs. So basically, walkthroughs, mandatory.
Where is a dry run through mandatory versus straight to live fire?
Should be made explicit.
Yeah.
The coroner also recommended that the Coltana report recommendation that no-go areas behind concealed targets be marked on the outside walls containing such targets be included in doctrine.
Agreed.
I think we're all unanimous on that as well.
Yep.
He makes good sense, this coroner.
Mm.
So that's the end of the coroner's report. But as I said, I did look up some news articles in relation to this. And as I said, news articles indicate that there was litigation and that the Department of Defence was charged with exposing a worker to death or injury, to which it pleaded guilty to in early 2021 and was fined $1 million for that. The judge in that case said that the department had failed to ensure its safety policies were followed, despite previously promising to put in place safety compliance mechanisms. The judge said that the offence was not isolated failure, that the department was acutely aware of the risks of these exercises and, following other investigations, had previously committed to ensuring compliance with its safety policies. The department must actually learn from its previous mistakes and ensure that its safety requirements are fully implemented.
I would appreciate that. Yep.
So very similar to what the coroner is saying as well. As I said previously, the maximum penalty that could have been imposed was $1.5 million. However, this was reduced due to the department's guilty plea and cooperation and offer of reparations to Private Chalice's family. There was an order for compensation that was made to Private Chalice's family, with the details of that payment being suppressed.
Yep. Wild. Emma, why do you bring these things to us?
It's interesting because I actually remember, because I was living in the Northern Territory when this person passed away. I remember it. It was all over the news.
Yeah.
This young man who was killed during a live fire exercise.
Yeah.
Relatively new to the army and was training, and it was described as being, very shocking at the time. And then actually reading through this coroner's report now and realizing it's not the first death.
Yeah.
In very similar circumstances, and the fact that there was an inquiry. I don't know if there's an inquest. I didn't look into it, but there was obviously an internal inquiry in the Coltana inquiry where strong recommendations were made and not followed. And those recommendations are the same recommendations that were made by the coroner.
Yeah.
Which we often see, let's be honest, of like same with coronial inquest, that we see repeated recommendations being made across inquests.
And it's shocking that like 2 deaths, and it's not isolated to this one, as you just said, but like it needs to happen a second time for it to be taken seriously.
Yeah. And so when you were talking about that, where the judge in the workplace case had said, this is not the first time, it made me think of like, I wonder how many other near misses have occurred.
Yeah.
Like surely if 2 people have died, there have been other live rounds that have gone off that just have not hit people.
Yeah.
In ways that have been unsafe, that have suggested things should change. And I'd be really interested to know. And I'm interested that it wasn't brought up by the coroner or wasn't potentially looked into, but it probably was. It just probably didn't make it into the findings.
I was about to say, and I don't know to what extent the coroner could report on certain things because of confidentiality.
Because like it would have been reported by the army, but would the army have been?
Surely they would have been compelled to provide things like
potentially to the coroner.
Yes.
But in terms of what the coroner could publish.
Yeah.
In terms of public interest.
Yeah.
That it might have not extended to that.
And realistically, just reporting on the 2 deaths gets the point across.
Correct.
So you don't need to have reported on the other things.
Yes, but you're completely, I would be very surprised if there weren't other instances.
Because, the chances of you hitting someone and there happen to be someone standing behind versus a rogue bullet that's near someone who's standing behind. How could that not have been changed if that was something that was occurring more than once?
Yeah.
Or once. Once was enough.
Yes, yeah. And the question I've got as well is, they've said that they've implemented this now, but is it actually being done in practice? And we won't know that until such time that there's another death.
Correct.
Because
or
of it.
that it's been a long time and there's not been a death. But that's like decades.
Yeah. Like, so we don't actually even know whether it's been implemented in practice for these sorts of training scenarios.
Or we'd hope there'd be a whistleblower that would come and be like, you know what, this is not happening and it's not acceptable.
But it didn't happen in the previous 8 years.
Yeah, and remember, again, these people, generally people who sign up to the army are young people, to the extent that they're aware of, I mean, they should be aware of doctrine because they should be reading it, but to the extent that they're aware of these previous deaths and, this inquest and these recommendations and the implementation of these factors that are mandatory, unknown, so they don't know what they're whistleblowing on. Yeah. And also, as I said, they're often young. Not that it should matter, but generally people who are younger find it harder to
step up.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And
when you're junior, you are far more like terrified of that like consequence, that as you get more confidence in your role, you can then be like, you know what, this isn't right.
Yeah.
And so I agree that, it's harder when you're junior.
Yeah, and I understand that the army culture is a very specific culture.
Yes.
In the army, and I think that
it's perceived that way.
Yeah. That is just the the outside perception of it all. But yeah, it's definitely a community that sort of has its own ways.
Yeah.
It's run very differently to what, you know, us civilian societies are.
Yeah. And look, some of that's necessary.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening in to today's episode. I hope you learned something and enjoyed it, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.